Well, good morning, everybody, and don't be surprised. Today's geopolitical video conference will be in English for many reasons. First of all, because we have the great honor to welcome Kori Schake, and she is on the West Coast. It's a bit early there. It's so kind of you to wake up, or maybe not going to bed and waiting for this Zoom conference with Aspen in France, but thank you so much for joining us now, and that's also the reason why we're going to speak English. The second reason is obviously we're going to cover topics viewed from the US. We've had this series for a few weeks now, and we've always been with discussions more viewed on the European side. And obviously for you, as a director of the Foreign and Defense Policy Studies of the American Enterprise Institute, it's very important for us to have today your analysis, and I would say three main parts, and I know that's why and how you wanted to have the first part of the discussion today. Number one, obviously we've been through this pandemic situation, and it's clear that we all want to understand if it's going to be a geopolitical game changer. The second part clearly is there's a competition between great powers, and we want to understand, and we need to understand how the balance may change in the future. And third, I'm sure you have an opinion about how the US have handled this situation, and maybe also China and a few other key countries. So it's very, very important for us. I know you've interacted in the past with the Aspen Institute in the US. As you know, also there are 7 or 8 institutes all over the world. France is an historical one created by Olivier Médériot in 1983, and we have rejuvenated the organization over the past year. So you have around, not the table, but the screen, roughly 100 people listening to you and ready to ask many questions through Philippe Manière, whom you know well, because you're today with us thanks to Philippe and thanks to your alarm clock. And Philippe has organized everything with you, so he will moderate and organize this discussion. Philippe, the floor is yours. Thank you, Kori, again, and we're very keen to listen to you.
Thank you, Jean-Luc, and let me join Jean-Luc in thanking Kori really very sincerely for getting up that early, based in California. That's barely human. So thank you so much, Kori, for accepting to make this webinar. We are extremely proud and happy to have you with us today. Let me just briefly remind everyone of the procedure, the process of our webinars, and more broadly of the Aspen gathering and meetings, be they virtual or actual. First, we operate under the well-known Chatham House rules. That is that everyone is absolutely free to use what will be said and discussed, but there is no attribution. No one should use any kind of quotation attributing this or that sentence or this or that idea to anyone who will intervene, be it Kori or the other participants. The second thing I'd like to say before handing it over to you, Kori, because that's you that we want to be listening to for the coming hour, is the way for the participants to ask their questions. As you know, on the Zoom screen, you have the possibility to get to the conversation window that opens on the right of your screen, and here you can write your question. I will make the dirty job of combining, summarizing, pretending to arranging in a logical manner the questions as they will appear, and I will ask the questions to Kori, who will then reply in the order that we will have arranged. That's, I think, what you needed to know before we proceed. So again, Kori, 1,000 thanks for being with us today. We are very much looking forward to listening to you. And as we told you, we expect that you speak for 15-20 minutes in expressing some opening remarks, and then more if you want, of course, and then we will open up to a broader discussion. Thank you, Kori.
It's a great pleasure to be with you. And I first want to say thank you to everyone on the call for letting me do this in English, because I am not well educated enough to do it in French. So thank you very much for that graciousness. So I was asked to give some thought to what the pandemic means for international relations, in particular what it means for the burgeoning competition between China and the United States to lead or set the rules of international order. And then third, to say where I think this is headed. So first, what the pandemic changes. Well, obviously, it's damaging to an enormous number of people's health and well-being. My country leads the world in infections, in deaths, and in deaths per million population, which is a shocking outcome for a country that's prosperous and has a well-developed public health system. And what we are seeing in the United States is a colossal failure of the federal government to prepare for what was, because of the sorrows that Chinese were suffering at the outbreak, the rest of our governments had a little bit of time to prepare for this. And my own government didn't use that time well in all sorts of ways that we are seeing. The American political system being so profoundly federal, what we have seen subsequently is 50 different states taking 50 different approaches. Hawaii has done amazingly well in limiting the damage. My great golden state of California has not done particularly well. New York has broken the back of its pandemic. So you see the widely varied outcomes and the widely varied willingness to disrupt economies and normal life in the United States. I think the American experience, as so often, is pretty sharply different even from other countries of similar prosperity, of similar governance, and of similar public health. It's been extraordinary to watch how well many countries have handled the pandemic, and particularly those free societies that had experience of SARS or previous very dangerous epidemics. I mean, it's extraordinary how well Taiwan and South Korea and New Zealand have managed the pandemics. And I think a big part of why they have done well is they have sad prior experience, but they also have publics with a high level of trust in their governments. And what has made the United States great is deep distrust of its government by its own public. So those of us who work on international affairs were initially really worried that authoritarian societies like Russia and China were, because they could demand compliance of their populations, were going to manage the pandemic well, and that would make the case for advancing free societies, advancing the notion that people have rights and they loan them in limited ways to governments for agreed purposes. That was going to be made harder, but that's not been borne out, in part because European countries have done a pretty good job. Taiwan, New Zealand, Australia, South Korea have done superb jobs. And China and Russia have not done particularly good jobs, despite the ability to impose really draconian controls on their own population. So what will it change in the international order? I think it's going to it has brought globalization to a screeching halt for a while, but I'm skeptical that it will do much damage to the advance of free movement of people, goods, and money eventually. I think the pressure by governments to get their economies working for their people again is going to return to a lot of those same pressures. It will, however, give governments like mine an excuse to do things that they wanted to do anyway, to force some renationalization of supply chains, particularly to exclude China from those supply chains. I think it will, we are already seeing most governments, certainly most governments in free societies, come up with stimulus packages to protect workers and to protect businesses. And those are also national in both origin and application, as they well should be. States have a right to prioritize their own individuals, their own citizens. But as economies recover, the business case for continued globalization, I think, will remain very strong. So I'm not sure it's going to have as big an effect, for example, as The Economist magazine is persuaded that it will, that this will be the end of neoliberalism. I'm skeptical of that. I think the business case will carry. To the second set of issues, which is great power competition. Let me start with China, because they've had a bad pandemic. Not only the suffering that they have experienced, but the policy choices they have made about the pandemic have been pretty deeply damaging to China's prospects. So first, the attempt to cover up the outbreak rather than report it to governments and the World Health Organization prevented other countries having as much information as would have helped them make good choices about protecting their own populations. So it will deepen distrust of China. The second thing is watching the extreme nature of China's shutdown, right? Drones informing on citizens and affecting their social capital score in the repressive authoritarian surveillance state that China is becoming. Gives pause to societies that don't want that kind of relationship between their government and their citizens. Gives them pause about China's businesses being ordinary businesses and being willing to operate in other societies by the rules of those societies. The attempt by the Chinese government to mobilize diaspora populations in Australia, New Zealand, the United States, to support the Chinese government also makes free societies nervous. And I guess China has increased, not decreased, the aggressive military moves against their neighbors, most recently against India in the contested zone along their border. And maybe topping off with the wolf warrior diplomacy that threatens if there are consequences for China's behavior, that the countries that impose those consequences will feel the wrath of the Chinese state. All of those things are going to make it harder for China to become a great power and to compete with the United States in that space, because the secret genius of the liberal order that Europe and the United States created from the ashes of World War II is that it's voluntary, and there are few alternatives to get to national prosperity without enduring the freedom of the press, the freedom of assembly, the consent of the governed, that have made the liberal order successful, right? The dirty little secret is that it's voluntary and beneficial enough that countries opt into it. Now, China's not the only country that's had a bad pandemic. My country's had a bad pandemic as well, largely because of bad policy choices. I am unrepentantly one of those Republicans who objected to President Trump's election, and I object to his re-election, and working to see my sister's political party replace my own in power for a while we become deserving of Americans' votes again. So it won't surprise you that I think President Trump's done a shockingly bad job of the fundamental job of the federal government, protecting Americans, but also of all the easy ways that American governments typically do it, providing reliable information, coordinating work across the many disparate levels of power in the United States, modeling responsible behavior. You know, the president won't have a test in public, he won't wear a mask in public, he holds political rallies. But beyond that, you know, the United States is a country of immigrants, by which I mean to say we are risk tolerant by origin. And we mostly think our government's terrible at its job and doesn't know what it's doing. And we're also the people who voluntarily moved into Comanche territory. That is a dangerous place we didn't belong. And so there's one of the things that is distinctive about my country is a willingness to think we know better than our government. And in this case, we actually do know better than our federal government. And you see it by the disparities across different states, levels of education, levels of public health investment, sensible versus ridiculous decisions by governors. But, and it has coincided with large-scale protests in my country against police violence, against the lack of equal justice before the law. And so we look like a big disputatious mess. And that's an accurate read of the United States. But what I would say in addition is that this is what the United States looks like when we're getting it right. We're not good at having things right, we're good at getting things right. And if you look at attitudes about law enforcement, they've changed as radically as attitudes changed about gay marriage in the United States once the public was forced to look the issue square in the face. And I think the same thing is happening with the pandemic. So, so the United States this has been bad for American soft power, in addition to being bad for the lives and livelihoods of Americans. But what you also see is the great federal laboratory of everybody trying different solutions and best practices eventually painfully being adopted. And that's not newly the United States, that's always the United States. This isn't the first time we've been bad at big, important things, and it won't be the last. But the ability to self-correct is what free societies are better at, and what we see the gears painfully meshing on in the United States right now. The only last thing I will say about great power competition and the US is that as bad as my country looks, I cannot help but think that people living in authoritarian societies might want the opportunity to have different government solutions, to test whether the government knows what it's doing, to complain that the government doesn't know what it's doing, and to take action against it, as we see protesting Americans do. To see police chiefs in many major American cities kneeling in front of protesters is something I bet many Chinese wish they could have in their government. So it's not all bad, although it looks quite bad at the moment. My optimism about where this ends, and this will be my last couple of comments, is that I think the pandemic is going to require the United States to take a more expansive definition of national security. I mean, healthcare is going to become a national security issue. I think we're likely to see sustained downward pressure on defense spending in the US as pressure for fixing a lot of the fragilities we have seen emerge in the pandemic becomes central to everybody's political concerns in the US. So in an unexpected way, American power may end up solving many of its domestic shortcomings, and that may create a stronger foundation for the US in the great power competition, because most Americans looking at the rise of China think that if the United States would fix its own stupid problems, we wouldn't have to worry about the choices the Chinese government are making, because there are natural limits on the success of what China is attempting. It's very difficult for authoritarian societies to get right what your society and my society already has right about inclusiveness, about representation, about navigating the middle income trap and dragging your economy up the value chain. As somebody who spends a lot of time in Silicon Valley, I marvel that the Chinese think they can get a creative-driven economy without the tiresome sanctimoniousness of the world conquerors of Silicon Valley, who are just sure they know better than all the rest of us, and the government has to hear it from them. So I think I'll stop there, my friends, and take any objections, questions, or better ideas that you might offer.
Thank you very much, Kori. It was very inspiring, and I like the image of a big disputatious mess that will finally triumph over the over-organized societies of a competitive great power. I can see that some questions are already piling up. I will transmit them in a minute. I'd like, just before doing that, to ask you this question. Yes, I do believe, like you, that this disputatious mess based on representation, on inclusiveness, will finally triumph and is more effective, but it's a bit counterintuitive. First, because people tend to pretend to think that order is more efficient than disorder, and also because China is doing a lot of advertisement of its efficiency based on this order of a big country where people in a way align based on the solution found by the government, whereas in the US there is not such a thing, of course. So there is no pretension that this mess, you were mentioning it yourself, but it's not something that is common sense all around the world, that a mess, the perceived mess, will be effective. It's again, it's counterintuitive. Aren't you afraid that what we saw, based on the not very successful manner to trade habit, both in China and in the US, but also based on the fact that basically China does propaganda, whereas the US does not, will end up in other countries to have a kind of natural preference for order and efficiency the China way, as much of a lie as it is fundamentally.
It's a great challenge, Philippe. Philosophically, I just can't be moved off my belief that Hegel was right, and that as people become more prosperous, they become more demanding political consumers. And I think that's as close to the political law of gravity as exists. And I believe I see it happening in China, right? The smartest diplomatic move the United States has made against China in the last 20 years was the US Embassy posting the air quality index on its website. So that the people of Beijing could see what their government would not tell them, which was how dangerous the air they are breathing was. It made a huge shift in what the Chinese government paid attention to. First of all, they tried to make us take the information down because they wanted their own public not to know. Second, when the American embassy refused to, they had to do something about it. And so it's not the case that even the government of China is so insulated from what its population wants that it can afford to ignore it. And that's the vulnerability of authoritarian societies. In free societies like yours and mine, you have the open argument and you have to win the argument in order to have legitimacy to govern. The same is true in authoritarian societies, they just mask it with repression. But if you look at the way the Saudi government is worried about the popularity of the ruling family, or look at the way Putin has had to move the referendum on his unlimited extension of his rule, or look at the way the Chinese government is worried about public reaction to environmental issues. Accountability comes for us all. What free societies have is accepted and agreed ways of contending over those issues. And I think that's actually showing to advantage in all sorts of countries, right? Germany looks pretty good at the moment as a model of governance. And what I think you see with the Chinese model is its enthusiastic adoption by would-be repressive governments. And it will be a challenge for free societies to contest that. But we're about to have a great big advantage, which is the second order effects of economic effects of the pandemic. China is the world's biggest lender, right? It's the world's biggest creditor, in part because of the Belt and Road Initiative. And as the pandemic perks through developing countries, countries that have less well-resourced public health systems, both the human and the economic consequences are going to be enormous. And that will make many of the Belt and Road projects unsustainable, unprofitable. And China has a big choice to make, whether they want to forgive those loans, repossess the infrastructure, or try and coerce money out of those governments. There are going to be calls on those of us in the West to protect countries if China chooses repossession or intimidation. And so that could heat up a lot of this competition very quickly. But it will also, I really genuinely don't think we need to worry about the long-term competition with China. I think we need to worry about the near-term competition with China before the limits of their economic model and the magnetism and appeal of it become generally accepted.
Thank you. I'd like to combine two questions, two remarks that were made first by General Jean-Paul Paloméros and also by Alice Solavagione about the transatlantic link bound and the U.S. international commitments, because I think it's not exactly the same questions, but of course they obviously combine. What would be your recommendations to reinvigorate the crucial transatlantic bond, asked Jean-Paul Paloméros. And Alice Solavagione asked, is the withdrawal from multilateralism a Trump factor or something deeper connected to deeper trends within the US society? So again, it's not exactly the same question, so please feel free to reply in distinct manner to the two questions or to combine, as I was tempted to do.
They're both great questions. So on the first one, on restoring the transatlantic link, I think my answer is we need to elect a different president, because the appreciation for the transatlantic link is quite widespread and quite deep in the United States. If you look at polling done by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, what you see across the three main issues that have been the signature political issues of President Trump, that is immigration, trade, and alliances, you have seen some of the biggest shifts in attitudes that they have ever recorded, away from the president's policies and positions. And so what I believe happens, you know, the American political system is tied so tightly to public attitudes that we always overcorrect. The president, both as a campaigner and as a president, has been extraordinarily good at asking fundamental questions. Why don't allies like Germany do more for their own defense instead of relying so heavily on us? Because we would like good public transportation systems too, but we feel like we can't afford them. But what you have seen in the polling, and it's quite consistent in American public attitudes, is that they think the president has a point about that, and then they see how his policies, what the consequences of the policies are on trade, immigration, and alliances, and they oppose the policies. So let me give one other piece of data that supports that belief, which is the acts of Congress in opposition to the president, right? The first piece of legislation that the Congress passed in January of 2019 was to prevent the president from having money to remove US troops from Europe. And they just passed the same legislation to prevent the president removing troops from South Korea. So even among my fellow Republicans, there is an appreciation of the damage the president is doing to our alliance relationships, which provide strategic depth for the United States. So I'm not worried about that. I'm worried about the president's choices. I'm not worried about Americans on that, because I think attitudes, while initially saying, hey, yeah, that guy's got a point, came back to, oh yeah, this is why we want friends in the world. And on the remind me of the second question, Philippe.
Well, it was more broadly multilateralism. Is there something?
Oh yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
So Americans are not comfortable multilateralists, and we never have been. As Woodrow Wilson could tell you, it's always a struggle to get Americans to play team sports and in ways that lock us into institutional responsibilities. But what I think occasioned the collapse of support for multilateralism in the US was a lack of confidence that we have the ability to get the outcomes that we want. And that's kind of surprising given how broad American structural power is in those institutions. And my own view is that it is a moment in time, was a moment in time where Americans were thinking, this is too hard. That is, we were so powerful and so lazy that we didn't want to bother. And we are now seeing the consequences of not bothering, right? China runs 5 of the 13 UN organizations, including international air traffic and the World Health Organization. And we sure don't like that either. So the alternative is helping put ourselves and friends in positions of power, as the US, even under the Trump administration, has just done with ICANN. What is it? It's the international agency that does standard setting for innovation, right? We wanted an American ally in charge of that because we didn't want the Chinese to be able to set the rules in a way that would be disadvantageous to us and our friends.
Thank you. There is an interesting question. We will change continent in a way on Africa. Ska is asking on Africa, what is Africa's place in this great powers competition? And do you think it might benefit emerging powers such as Turkey to gain more leverage and strengthen their soft power? This is this question of Africa being, in a way, the field where these, of course, I'm simplifying outrageously, but this new Cold War between China and the US, France playing a small role historically on the continent. We would be happy to have your comment on what is happening in Africa and its role in this competition of great powers.
That's a fabulous question. And I do think the countries of the African continent are likely to experience a lot of pressure from both China and the United States as pawns in a great chess game. The United States has been slow to realize that African countries aren't basket cases. They're not places that need our assistance. We have had a retrograde mindset when, in fact, the peoples of different African countries have renovated banking by using cell phones way before the rest of us did. And seeing the experimentation and the innovation and the great leaps forward in responsible governance in so many African countries is something American policy has been slow to pick up on. But many of the policy tools like the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which shifted the basis of American assistance from need to rewarding good governance, because that's actually how you are going to help people solve problems. We have the right tools. The Chinese intervention in many African countries has been to assist in the construction of infrastructure to help economic development. And in the abstract, it's a really smart choice. The problem is how the Chinese have done it, bringing in Chinese workers, not being respectful of local laws and practices. And the United States knows what that looks like, because that's what we did in Latin America and many other places 100 years ago. And we are still living down the bad reputation we rightly deserve for that behavior. So I think both the sustainability of many of those Chinese investments are coming into doubt, but also the desirability of them on the part of many of the recipients. And what the rest of us need to do is up our game and use the World Bank and the IMF to help countries make the economic strides that their publics deserve and that are going to make all of us more prosperous, not just peoples of different African countries more prosperous.
Maybe a word on Turkey, because it was mentioned. You are an absolute expert on the Middle East. The role Turkey has been playing in the recent years in the region as a whole, and more recently in Libya and this part of the world would certainly is certainly something interesting to you as well.
Yeah, so I think we are not optimistic enough about Turkey because repressive as President Erdogan is and dangerous as his policies in Syria and Libya are, there's a lot of positive change going on in Turkey. I mean, the fact that the opposition holds the mayoralties of the two largest cities and politics in Turkey required the president to acknowledge those political losses. The fact that his own party has fractured and conservatives are striking out and separating his power base, and the fact that Turkey's economic model was working magnificently before government repression started impeding its outcomes. My own view is that Turkey's intervention in Syria was an opportunity we, and particularly my country, created by not protecting the people of Syria from the worst government on the scene right now, and that by abandoning those forces internal to Syria and also those forces, Kurdish forces in northern Iraq and elsewhere, we created a vacuum that Turkey stepped into that is bad for Syrians, and I think will eventually be bad for Turks as well. On the bigger question of Turkey's role in the world, my colleague at AEI, Karen Young, is doing a tracker of investment by countries in the Middle East outward, because we see the GCC countries, we see Turkey trying to compete with investments and business relationships in the Horn of Africa in particular. It's a really interesting development that it's not yet clear to me whether it will result in foreign policy influence, but we begin to see big flows of investment there.
Thank you. There is a question combining your, your love for geopolitics and your love for your dear Golden State, about the Silicon Valley. Redouane Zengi is asking whether you think that the current turmoil in the US, due both to the pandemics and to the racial unrest, may cause some kind of damage to the American innovators' dominance, and may advance China's agenda for that matter. Could we see a sinking, to be caricatural, could we see a sinking Silicon Valley because of all what is happening in the US right now? And of course, in compensation, in a way, China rising in terms of innovations and ability to dominate the world for that matter?
That's a fabulous question. I do not think so, for a couple of reasons. First, because Chinese behavior, even on this platform of Zoom, censoring Chinese participants and intruding in conversations when subjects like Tiananmen Square are being taught by universities, is an interesting is an interesting example, right? Because Zoom, in order to remain, first of all, Zoom grew so fast because of the pandemic that they were rushed into working at scale without working all of their problems out, which that's a high-class problem. To be so successful, you're way out ahead of your skis. But they are now incorporating end-to-end encryption in response to concerns about Chinese government intrusion. That is, they are becoming Western in their practices, which is great for us. And I think that's something that we in the West underestimate. That is because we have lost confidence that our values are universal, that a mother of 5 kids in rural Pakistan wants the same things I want, that we're underappreciating the magnetism of our practices and our values. And I think we should be more confident. On Silicon Valley, I think social media companies are gonna get destroyed. I think Facebook is gonna be like the Statue of Liberty in the Planet of the Apes movies. We're gonna see it crashed on a beach and think, what was that? And they deserve it because they have gotten all of the benefits of the go-go communications revolution and are taking no responsibility for the damage they are doing to democracy in America. And the pendulum is swinging. The American Congress is going to sound a lot more like the European Commission in saying that—
Unbelievable.
Yeah, who can imagine? In saying that companies have responsibility when they have that kind of reach. And I think, but I also think you see companies that are not Facebook reading the direction of travel and making changes, right? I mean, that Twitter is putting warning labels on the President of the United States when he talks dangerous nonsense. I think social media is a particular part of Silicon Valley that has gotten all of the benefits and borne few of the consequences, but that change is coming. And for the rest of the innovation ecosphere, I think it's gonna go like gangbusters as a result of the pandemic, because so much has to change and we all have to figure it out. So I think I actually see a lot of interesting experimentation. How do governments deliver social services when you can't have big gatherings? My sister, who's a Democratic political wheeler and dealer, is trying to figure out how the Democratic convention can take place without any people. And so all of those kinds of, need drives innovation. And so I don't see, and one last thing, I'm sorry for a sloppy answer, but the last thing is that there is going to be so much desperation to get our economies back to work. I mean, recorded unemployment right now is only 13% in the United States, but that's likely to be enduring because businesses are failing and people are being fired rather than laid off as the stimulus payments come to an end. So there's going to be a lot of permissiveness towards businesses in order to get our economies running again.
It's I'm thinking of what you are saying about Facebook. It's interesting. I read yesterday that Facebook is more or less, at great pains developing more in Western countries, but they are doing very well in Asia. So it's interesting to see that they are shifting to new populations and closer to China in a way, even be it only geographically. I'd like to ask you a question that was submitted by Vincent de la Bachellerie. He says himself it's a naive question. Vincent, I'm not sure it's such a naive question, but that's an interesting one. on the US economy and the general perception of the US about the withdrawal of the Paris Agreement. Is it something that is consensual in the US? And Vincent, in a witty manner, observes that even if the US has retracted from the Paris Agreement, there is a lot of US activity in participating in setting the standards of, ESR and so on. There is this permanent standardization of accounting for ESR and so on. So the US, are the US still on board, or are they only taking advantage of what business can be done based on the standardization?
So I'm so glad to get that question, because it allows me to sing a song of what the United States is actually good at. It may surprise you, my friends, but according to Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, the first country that is going to meet its Paris Climate Accord guidelines is actually the United States of America. Despite withdrawing from the treaty, despite regulatory rollback by the Trump administration, despite overt hostility by the federal government to it, the great golden state of California, Apple computers, Mike Bloomberg's money, my mom wanting the world to be a nice place for her grandchildren, are all propelling American society towards greater action on climate. So it's a nice reminder that the federal government is very often irrelevant to what the United States does, because once you win the political argument, Americans aren't good at organized strategic direction. We're good at, with apologies for it being a baseball analogy, we're good at small ball, at the little things that add up to big consequence, because we're a diverse, disputatious people who want lots of different things, but the Rotary Club and the student union at Iowa State University and all that stuff adds up. And the political argument has actually been won in the United States on climate. What we are disputing internally among ourselves is, can't you innovators find a way to do this that costs us no money, right? We want battery-powered SUVs, gigantic things. We don't want to make any sacrifices to achieve this, which will sound pretty typically American, I suspect, to most of you.
That's right. As we're getting, unfortunately, close to the end of this fascinating seminar, I'd like to ask you a question, Kori, based on your one of your last books. I think it's not even the latest one, even if it's very fresh, A Safe Passage. I don't know whether it can be seen here. I think it's Harvard University. I love this book, not only because it's extremely well researched, but also I envy your frugal style. It's brilliantly written. The argument basically is that the transition from the hegemony from the UK to the US was smooth, partly by chance, but mainly because of the community of views between the former and the new hegemons. And your argument is that it's absolutely exceptional. But in history, usually it doesn't happen. The transition from one hegemon to the next one is normally more or less made through a war or some kind of brutal opposition, which did not happen between the UK and the US for very specific and in a way trivial and cultural reasons. I'd like to get back to our, title of this webinar to go back to the competition between the current hegemon, the US, and likely to be future hegemon, China. Based on your analysis, it cannot go in a smooth manner because basically there is no such a thing as a common set of values between the US and China. You've been so optimistic in so many of your replies, which I admire, and it's very confronting to us. I'd like to challenge you in terms of challenging your optimism on this broader topic of can we have a smooth transition between the current and the possible future hegemon given their differences?
No, we cannot. But that does not dent my optimism, Philippe, because I don't believe China can continue to rise without liberalizing. I think they have very nearly reached the end of the road for the Chinese model. And I actually think the Chinese Communist Party knows that. And the increases in repression in the last 10 years and the desire to catapult forward, the question that I think people who argue that China's rising inexorably need to answer is, if that is true, why did the Chinese government activate the antibodies against their continued rise now? Why not wait 15 years until they had won the AI race and consolidated control of emergent technologies? Why not wait until the United States ruins its alliance relationships rather than behaving in ways that reinforce them? And I think for me, the answer is because Xi Jinping and his comrades, they think the window's closing. They think they need to try and affect change now before they get bogged down in the middle income trap, before more Chinese inventors leave the country. 90% of the Chinese engineers who come to the United States for their education stay in the United States. 85% of Chinese millionaires, according to the Bank of China, are applying for the ability to live in other countries. And the top two destinations are Canada and the US. So there are real problems and strains in the Chinese model, even before you get to the awakening of conscience of Chinese people themselves about 1 million Uyghurs in concentration camps. There are real limits on the success of this model going forward. And the people who appreciate that most deeply are the people ruling China. And so I am optimistic that China's gonna liberalize, that the fragility of Xi Jinping's hold on power is actually going to be contested inside China and drive towards greater liberalization. And the kind of competition with China that all of our economies are gonna have to deal with when it's a free society and has efficient allocation of capital through markets, that's going to be a really stiff competition, and it'll be great for us all.
But it will allow for a peaceful transition, if any, between the two hegemons, if, as you were forecasting, China is liberalized ahead of the transition.
Yeah, because as in the British to American transition, what will make it peaceful is if people don't think it will matter, right? And if China actually becomes a responsible stakeholder in the international order, that if China as a great power doesn't feel like a threat to the United States and France, we won't care if they run UN bodies, right?
That's right. Thank you so much, Kori. Hand it over to Jean-Luc now. Thank you again.
On this note of real optimism and creativity, thank you so much, Kori. I think you made our day, or at least mine, I'm sure for the participants. Obviously, thanks to your analysis of the geopolitical situation and the consequences of this crisis, certainly with the analysis you did of the US and the way your president that you like so much handled this situation. By the way, if you can give us the name of one person still supporting him, apparently he might be reelected. But we never have in front of us at Aspen, in France, or wherever, somebody saying, I'm a fan, I'm a great fan. And we would like to have the same kind of session with a great fan of the president. It would help us understand the dynamics. But it's just, if you have a great idea for us, not only because you've been with a vision and optimism, but you really made my day when you say that the social media will crash. I hate them a lot, probably even more than you. I think it's absolutely bad and terrible on the 21st century on the behavior of people, cultural level of information and way all this is handled. So thank you for making at least my day. I would love to invite you to Paris and have the same kind of meeting in person as soon as we can. We'll probably visit you because some of us come for the business to the Silicon Valley once a year, and we'll certainly create, thanks to this first discussion, a real relationship between us. And I really hope that you will have the opportunity to come over to Europe, and we'll organize something around you to push a bit more on some of these topics and make sure that we get the benefit from your vision and your thoughts. Now it's 1 p.m. here. It's probably 4 a.m. for you. You have the choice between going back to bed or going to bed, or maybe have a French croissant, Italian espresso. You will tell us what you do. We're really sorry we disturbed you this way, but we're grateful you accepted to do this. And as I use your language and your culture, it's a great opportunity for me to tell our members that in the American culture, all the participants support this kind of institute. You're teaching in so many universities and institutes that you give me the opportunity. In French, sometimes it's a bit more difficult to say, but for those who are on this conference, please send your annual fee to Aspen and the support, because we organize this kind of event. And as we share.
Exactly right. Civic activism is the great saving grace of free societies, my friend.
That's right. Thank you, Kori.
And next week, and we'll send you date and confirmation. We'll be back to Europe with the discussion between France and Germany after the announcements done by President Macron and Chancellor Merkel. And we'll also have before the end of July, when we will have probably some rest after all these events, another discussion between France and Italy, which is another forum that has been created by Aspen France with Aspen Italia, and many other topics to come. So thanks to all for your participation, and talk to you soon. And Kori, you have a red carpet in Paris whenever you decide to come.
Great, I'll take it.
Thank you so much, Kori. Thank you.